So, good afternoon, everyone. We are really happy that you are here in our forum, in our panel discussion for today, because there's strong competition, as you know, always here at this time slot. My name is Achim Spiller. I'm head of the advisory board of our German Ministry for Agriculture and Food, the Scientific Advisory Board, and I'm happy to guide you today through our discussion. Some short remarks, if you like. There's a translation from English to German, if you like, headphones outside. Unfortunately, there is a live stream, but there's no opportunity to ask or give questions via live streams, only for you here in the room for the last half hour or so. You can always ask, and then please take a micro for that, because we have the colleagues in the live stream in the internet. And my last short remark is about these small cards on your seat. There's a QR code, and with this QR code you have the opportunity to download the opinion paper from our Scientific Advisory Board about our recommendations which we present today. So we are very happy to have you here for today. And we have on the one hand, the opportunity to present our opinion paper from the Scientific Advisory Board, which we presented to Minister Özdemir last December, so it's quite fresh. This is a picture from the Scientific Advisory Board from the colleagues. It's an interdisciplinary board from nutrition scientists and agricultural economic scientists as well, and we had the special opportunity to have a colleague, Bettina Rudloff, with us, who supported us in working on this opinion paper, and Bettina is also here today for discussion. Today we have also more fresh paper to present, a paper which Sophia will present today, which is really new from yesterday or so. No? Things are quite really produced for this event, so to say, and the first discussion about this new OECD paper, the review of G7 government-led voluntary and mandatory due diligence measures for sustainable agri-food supply chains. Long title, but in both papers we gave an overview about the new, the EU deforestation regulation, the CSDD regulation, and other scientific new regulations for corporate social due diligence. A quite new topic, a quite challenging topic, and we are very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this today with a really important panel. But first, let me introduce with one slide the importance of the topic. Here you see only two numbers to say why it is important to develop corporate social due diligence throughout the whole value chain internationally, and to guarantee more on a mandatory basis measures to really save people, social circumstances in countries, especially in low-income countries, but not only in low-income countries. We have also our European problems in supply chains, and this corporate social responsibility topic I think is really an important one, especially for agriculture. It's a cross-sectoral measure, but it's important for agriculture because we have a lot of problems in our sector. But on the other hand, we also have developed some measures. Take the example of certification procedures, which are quite important in the agricultural sector. And so maybe some other sectors could learn from the agriculture sector as well. So what is our today's agenda? We first have two keynotes about the two papers which I just presented. One from Christine Wieck from the Scientific Advisory Board on the one hand, and the other from Sophia Günnig from the OECD about this really new paper which you can download on the OECD website as well. And then we have a really nice panel discussion, and I will introduce our panel discussions later on. And in the end, you have the opportunity to ask or to discuss with us. So without taking more time, I just hand over to Christine Wieck. Christine Wieck is a professor at the University of Hohenheim for Ag-Econ, and before joining the University of Hohenheim, she worked for the GIZ for some years. So her main topic is international agricultural economics and trade. And Christine was a leading author of this paper, which she presents us now, with this special topic for today on including partner countries in these new measures. Christine.
Thank you very much, and welcome also from my side. New diligence obligations for companies in the agri-food sector, and I'm going to talk about our study, which had a couple of perspectives that we took in order to analyze these due diligence obligations. We started with the idea to do a small study, maybe 30, 40 pages, because we thought it's doable. We ended up with 300 pages and 2.5 years later, and we realized that just looking at the economic perspective or just looking at the trade perspective is not enough. And that's how we ended up having 6 different perspectives in looking at the impact, the changes that these due diligence regulations will bring about, likely. And hence we started with business management and the impacts, because that's clearly fundamental, because the companies are the ones who have to implement that. But we also looked at administration, because the governments have to supervise, have to implement, and have to very strongly interact with the companies on that. And there is a lot to say about that, and this can lead to a good implementation or a bad implementation. And so, let alone these 2 topics, that's probably 100 pages in our study. And then we looked at law, we looked at foreign trade, international relations, because there's always also the partner side, those countries, third countries, cross-border value chains that also have to deal with that when we have these regulations here in the EU. And clearly there's also a policy coherence side, because this the sustainability transformation that we observe touch upon many different policy fields, and you have to think about them in a coherent and integrated way. And that's not always the place, and so you also have to look at that from a scientific analytical perspective. What are the due diligence regulations that we looked at? We started with the German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, with the German regulation, but it became evident that we also have to look at the EU side, because important things are developing there. And it was a permanent adjustment of our study, because then the deforestation regulation is already in place. And the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, is still hopefully pretty close to being finished. The trialogue is ready, is finally negotiated, and now it has to be agreed upon, but we have to press our fingers to see what's going to happen in the next weeks and months. And we as a scientific advisory board, after many, many discussions, we also had expert consultations with a large number of people. We finally agreed that we support this type of regulation, that we think it's important, and that many important changes can, and that support this green transformation, the sustainable transformation of value chains can be achieved by that. But clearly we also see issues, implementation issues, and that's why we ended up with these rather long recommendations where we see that there's need of action. And so what did we look at? In the end, it's about progress for human rights and environment, and we looked at it from different analytical perspectives. What are the mechanisms of action? What are trade-offs? What are synergies? What is effectiveness, efficiency in the implementation? Is the way how it's implemented really the best way to do it? What could be potential unintended effects and limits? And what are conditions to achieve these goals? And today, as you can imagine, we can do, and we are actually planning a lecture series on the study together with co-authors and other interested authors. So there are many, many different aspects that you can talk about. Today we focus on norm diffusion and partner uptake. And so norm diffusion and partner uptake, what does it mean? Norm diffusion means the adoption of certain international norms by an increasing number of states. And that's why we are so happy that the BMEL at the G7 gave the order to the OECD, or asked the order, requested the OECD to analyze what's happening internationally there, because it's not only Germany, there are several European states, but there are also internationally several countries that have started to develop their own due diligence regulation. And if this is going to be internationally a success, these regulations have to harmonize, have to align with each other at some point. And the other issue is obviously partner uptake, because the acceptance and extensions of regulations is very important, because we are talking about a very globalized agri-food market. We are talking about cross-border trade. There are very important problems also in particular with respect to social standards, with respect to labor rights, also with respect to environment, often at the beginning of international value chains, and hence partners need to be involved. And we do give a lot of recommendations on that as well. And just to show you the dimension of this topic, obviously during the implementation or during the debate about this international, this European legislation, also when the German one was negotiated, but now at the European level there's even more debate about that. Also the partners were not always happy about it. And for example, there was a joint letter to the WTO from Indonesia and Brazil and other trading partners about the European regulation on deforestation regulation, EUDR, where they said that regrettably, given scarce consideration has been given by the EU to the issues, the problems that were raised by trading partners. Hence, there is still, even though, for example, the EUDR is now in force, in the implementation, there is still a lot that can be done and that can lead to good or bad developments. And just to give you some ideas on the analytical dimensions, because I won't have the time to go into it into more detail, what did we do? What did we look at? We looked at policy coherence issues, for example, in section 5.4 of our study. We looked at market segmentation and what are the conditions that market segmentation occur and how could this be prevented. And meaning analytical dimension means we looked into the literature, what's there in academia, and we try to synthesize that and get that into our study, because we as an advisory board, we are working totally in our spare time, basically. And so we don't have the time and the money to do our new studies ourselves. Instead, it's more that we synthesize findings from the literature and try to make them accessible for policy and in particular for the Ministry of Agriculture that we are working. That is our main contact point. So we looked at market segmentation, we looked at partner uptake, what are success factors that we could identify in the literature that could help that these type of regulations become a success. And we also looked quite intensively at international relations because given the colonial history and the claims of green colonialism, green grabbing, of carbon colonialism, which were also raised in the context of the study, we felt that this is an important issue that also has to be addressed by our study. And there's also something which is called the Brussels effect in the literature that's discussed, where there are positive examples where legislation that was coming out of Brussels has been taken up by other countries around the world, and they identified, for example, as factors that contribute to that issues like ownership, and if regulation aligns well, links well to local reform processes that in other countries may also be occurring. And so these were analytical findings that we used in order to come up with our recommendations. And before we came up with the recommendations, we were thinking about how can we evaluate the impacts of this new legislation, because one of the problems is that currently there are no quantitative studies yet. And so what we did, we started to develop scenarios, hypothetical scenarios with best and worst outcomes. And we looked along 3 dimensions. We looked along the process dimension, we looked along the market-related dimension and an implementation-related dimension. And so we thought, regarding the process of negotiating and implementing these measures, what could be a good and a bad scenario? The one would be totally unilateral, EU does their thing, and the EU and Germany do their thing, and there's no cooperation with the potential partner countries. The alternative could be cooperation and dialogue. And the same when we look at market impacts, there can be market segmentation or there could be norm diffusion. And when we look at businesses and business implementation and how businesses behave, there could be that businesses, if you look at the scenario U2, they say, oh, this is a nightmare, we just cut and run, so we go out of these markets. Or they could just try to deal with all the paperwork, that's mostly paperwork that's coming along, in order to document what you do in terms of due diligence. There could be just the bureaucratic regulations, or there could be a scenario where also companies really try to stay and work with the local conditions on the ground and try to make these, to improve on labor conditions and environmental issues when there are problems. If there are no problems, nothing needs to be done. And so these were these type of scenarios, and then we were starting to think what needs to be the conditions in order to achieve the most desired outcomes. And that's how we developed then our recommendations. And today, as I said, we look at norm diffusion and partner uptake because due to time issues. And yes, and so here we go into a little bit more detail. What does it mean in terms of process-related and market-related dimension? So if you look at this P2 scenario, for example, cooperation, partnership, and dialogue, where at least from our perspective, that would be the most desirable outcome. It would mean that the EU really also in bilateral, multilateral, and plurilateral activities and dialogue mechanisms, they really try to push for this type of regulation, and they also try to partner up with partners, with trading partners in the local implementation, and really also try to take up what's on the ground happening in many countries, so that there would be an acceptance of the regulations by the trading partners. And if you look at the market-related dimension, If you look at this scenario M2, there would be, when the Brussels effect takes place, there would be an imitation of the approach by many other countries. There would be coherence with trade policy and a guarantee that broadly recognized standards in the field of human rights, labor rights and environmental norms would be distributed. There is already a glass of water. Can you hand it to me, please? Yeah, thank you. And so our general recommendations, now we have clustered them into 3 groups for an effective implementation, because implementation is really key, and that the industry really has not to get a bureaucratic burden, too much bureaucratic burden on that. But obviously we also see the policy environment as very important, and we also see that there are issues in these due diligence proposals that needs to have a little bit more thinking. Not all of these due diligence things that are discussed, for example, regarding to food security, regarding to biodiversity, regarding to climate, regarding to several issues, not all of them are already so well developed that it's clear how companies can contribute to it in their area of action. And so we also see there are some issues where we would like to see more systematic continued development before they become reality in a compulsory obligation. And obviously there were a couple of cross-cutting recommendations regarding supporting companies, impact assessment and dialogue. Still some time left? Yeah, okay, good. Then let me dive a little bit more into these specific recommendations. And as I said, you can, in the study, you can find this really extensively. Today we have picked out the recommendations that focus on norm diffusion and partner uptake. But regarding the effective implementation, it's really about supporting the supplier development, provide support in forms of financial support, in forms of public programs, and clearly here also the government has to support with aligning development programs and things, so that really here development policy and business policy work together to implement these type of policies. We think that certification schemes are really important in order for companies maybe to get certified with one scheme, and then from there on they can be sure that they have fulfilled all due diligence obligations. But for this, certification schemes need to be reliable. Like, for example, the organic certification scheme, which is guaranteed, which is backed up by EU rules. And we think that here also in the certification sector maybe a little bit more work needs to be done. And also regarding grievance mechanisms, German Beschwerdemechanismus, we think that there also this is very important, but it also has to be further elaborated. And we also see, for example, a role for civil society actors and trade unions here, so that they can really make sure that these type of grievance mechanisms are available anonymously to workers who would like to do something like that. And when we look at policy, the policy environment and the many different regulations that are, for example, at the EU level negotiated that somehow touch up the international dimension, clearly we need better coherence there, and also coherence between trade policy and support that's offered in order to implement this type of trade policies. We need dialogue. There are a lot of dialogue elements already at EU level, but we think that it's really important that these due diligence mechanisms are really becoming a regular standard part of that. And we also think that intensify and better development cooperation focusing on that should be part of the future policy in that area. And I mean, with Leonardo Mizzi from DG INPA, we definitely also have a very knowledgeable partner here in our panel later on. And when we look at the continued systematic development, clearly we need impact assessment. We also need an impact assessment that's not just focusing on EU businesses, but we also have to look at third partner impacts. And we also think that for the partner uptake, it's important to get those partners and their research institutions involved in the impact assessments. It's not necessary that's all done by EU research institutions or companies, because in the partner countries they usually also have very powerful and knowledgeable researchers. And we think regarding considering the scope of due diligence obligations, for example, regarding gender equality, right to food or biodiversity, it's important with these topics. These are very complex topics. Food security, that's not something that's just depending on companies. Companies have clearly a role to play there, but this is multidimensional, and here you really need to get into a thorough dialogue with partner countries and also with the governments and the businesses there. And so we think that there are different scales, or let's say advances, that can be done at a time. And overall, final remark, we think we are convinced that this is a suitable instrument to improve human rights and also certain environmental issues along value chains. And we really want to see a success there. But for this, it's really that we have to come to these, in our scenarios, to these most positive outcomes. If it just becomes a bureaucratic nightmare, or a paper tiger, as we would say in German, or if partners basically refuse to cooperate, or if companies say we just quit our businesses, then there's not the achievement that we would like to see. And hence it's a pledge to all stakeholders involved in these type of regulations, companies, really to engage and to think about how to solve, in particular, the labor rights issues along value chains, to focus for the administration to get better with implementation and monitoring of these activities, and also as international relations politicians who are involved in that really to think about how to get really to a partnership approach, how to involve monitoring activities, partners in monitoring activities, and really how to, to show sufficient sensibility and support, in particular for lower and middle income countries when implementing these type of regulations. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christine, to quickly run through this 300 pages and giving us a broader view on our recommendations and on our vision of a successful due diligence law. We have talked about the German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz and the EU regulations, but there's more in the field. And now we are coming to Sophia Günnig, and Sophia Günnig is a policy analyst at OECD, Centers for Responsible Business Conduct, and she leads the work on due diligence and responsible agriculture supply chains there. And she was one of the lead authors of the review which I have mentioned, and she will present today your main results in also 15 minutes or so. Thank you very much for directly coming from Paris through the winter time here to Berlin. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the organizers of the event for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be following on from such a great presentation and seeing so many complementary messages and echoing our own findings within this OECD paper. So yes, great to be up here. As mentioned, my name is Sophia Günnig. I lead the agriculture sector program at OECD's Center for Responsible Business Conduct, and I'm going to be presenting the findings of this report that's hot off the press. It came out yesterday for you. So just to provide a little bit of background on the report. The landscape of due diligence-related legislation and policy that's emerging around the world is really growing in terms of its size and complexity. Governments are increasingly adopting policy measures to promote more responsible business practices, supply chains and investments in order to align businesses' conduct with policy priorities related to sustainable development, including around climate change. This is happening through a mix of voluntary and mandatory measures, many of which are based on or reference international due diligence standards, though many of them differ in terms of their scope, depending on domestic priorities and context. So with funding from the German G7 presidency and consistent with ongoing efforts by the G7 to address environmental and social impacts within agricultural supply chains, the OECD compiled a selective inventory and a comparative overview of voluntary and mandatory government due diligence measures associated with G7 countries and the EU. The overall purpose of the review was really to create a basis for G7 countries and policymakers to identify common elements across the measures, and with a view to strengthen their quality and, where possible, their coherence. So, given the broad landscape of measures addressing the agricultural sector, it was really important for us as a first step to refine down the type of measures that we were going to look at. We didn't have the wonderful luxury of doing a 200-page report or 300-page report, so we had to narrow it down and get quite specific. So we selected measures based on two criteria. The measure had to be led or formally supported by a G7 government and or the EU. And this eliminated all industry, multi-stakeholder schemes or initiatives. Then the initiative also had to have a due diligence component to it, so a conduct or disclosure expectation that related to RBC due diligence. So this excluded all technical standards, laws, or certifications, for example, on food safety, on pesticide use, etc. It's important to note that by using these filters, we did actually come up with a number of measures that weren't agriculture specific. They were cross-cutting and broader, covering a number of different sectors within the economy. We do make reference within the report to other policies and mechanisms to incentivize responsible business conduct, such as public procurement, trade and investment policies, sustainable finance, as well as certifications, because we really wanted to note their importance within the kind of smart mix of measures. We go into a little bit more detail on the role of certification schemes and labelling in the paper, because we felt that they were particularly critical for the agricultural sector. They're widely used to promote sustainable practices and responsible business conduct. In the last decade, we've seen a proliferation of public and private certification schemes. And a number of the G7 policy measures that we look at actually make reference to certification schemes as a means to help companies comply with the expectations under the different measures. However, as noted in Christine's presentation, a number of the certifications or a number of the measures lack specificity about the role of these schemes in the context of a company's own due diligence practices, and whether or not companies have a responsibility to really check the credibility of the certifications that they're using. So ultimately, the report identifies 24 measures among G7 countries that can be applied to agricultural supply chains. And we classify those into 5 different categories. There are 3 different mandatory measures which we consider. So corporate disclosure measures, which require public disclosure of information on what companies are doing to identify and address environmental and social risks in their operations and supply chains. Trade-based measures, which prohibit the import, placing on the market, export, and use of products or commodities associated with adverse social and environmental impacts. And this is subject to a demonstration of adequate due diligence or due care. mandatory due diligence measures, which require companies to carry out due diligence in relation to specified adverse impacts associated with their operations, their suppliers, or their business relationships, without introducing any prohibitions on import or export or use of specific products. And then we look at two types of voluntary measures: government guidances, which set out guidance to promote sustainable and responsible business practices in global agricultural supply chains, and then government-led partnerships, which aim to promote more responsible business practices, including due diligence, and engage with stakeholders within supply chains. So among the 24 measures, we identified 10 that are mandatory measures, of which 3 are corporate due diligence disclosure measures, 5 are trade-based measures, and 2 are mandatory due diligence laws. 14 of the 24 are voluntary measures, 4 are government guidances, and 10 are government-led partnerships or initiatives. One thing we noted was that while promoting responsible agricultural supply chains is not a new concern for G7 policymakers, what we've seen is that in the past 3 years, there's been a sharp increase in the number of measures introduced by G7 governments. So 63% of the measures in scope of the paper were introduced in the past 3 years. We also included in the visual of the timeline the launch of the OECD FAO guidance on responsible agricultural supply chains, which is OECD's standard on due diligence in agricultural supply chains, to kind of show the evolution of these measures and where our instruments fit in. So the first part of the review looks at the similarities and differences in the design, scope, and objectives of all 24 measures. Some of the key variations that we identified include on risk scope. So the measures vary in whether they take a broad or a narrow approach to risk. 7 of the measures aim to address a broad range of sustainability risks, while the vast majority take more of a targeted approach and predetermine specific risks that businesses should be addressing. For measures that identified targeted specific risks, there seems to be a kind of a broad convergence around which issues governments consider to be the most important, with the majority of measures focusing on deforestation and forced labor. But among the measures, how those risks are defined, so definitions of deforestation, definitions of forced labor, do vary quite considerably. And we also noted that there was really limited integration of climate risks and impacts in the measures that we looked at. Another variation was on how commodity scope is addressed. So over half of the measures predefine specific commodities in scope of the measures. And the commodities are often selected by being associated with a specific risk. So 3 out of the 5 trade-based measures target a commodity related to deforestation or timber production, for example. And the trade-based measures tend to be more selective in terms of commodity scope than the mandatory due diligence or disclosure measures. Another variation that we noted was really in terms of supply chain scope. So while all of the measures attempt to address risks beyond a company's own operations, they vary considerably when applying due diligence expectations within the supply chain. Some of the measures focus on specific points or tiers in the supply chain, while others take a broader concept of supply chain or value chain. However, again, terms such as supply chain or suppliers are really underdefined, we noted within our review. There was also variation in terms of the entities and scope. Some of the measures look at large multinational enterprises, while others also include SMEs. The second part of the review looks specifically at the 10 mandatory measures and how they take different approaches to due diligence. And we use the OECD RBC due diligence framework as a reference point for this. We don't undertake a comprehensive analysis of the mandatory measures and how they integrate or align with our key due diligence principles or the 6-step due diligence framework, but rather we use it to highlight consistencies and inconsistencies between the different measures. So important takeaways from this are that the mandatory measures really take different approaches to due diligence, in part because of their core underlying objectives and nature, i.e. are they focused on information disclosure? Are they focused on market access? So what are their main objectives? And this has an important influence on what they consider to be due diligence. And this has impacts on how the measures approach two key elements of due diligence for the OECD. That is the risk-based approach and stakeholder engagement. So just for clarification, what do I mean by the risk-based approach? Well, in OECD standards, the action that an enterprise takes should be commensurate to the severity and the likelihood of the adverse impact that could take place. And equally, when it's not feasible to address all the identified impacts at the same time, all at once, enterprises should prioritize their responses based on the severity and the likelihood of that impact taking place. So action by business should be risk-based. But what we found was that measures with a narrow risk scope, i.e. those that predetermine risks, effectively prioritize specific issues over others. And they also prioritize certain risk factors over others, so certain geographies, certain business entities, certain commodities. And they tailor the due diligence requirements to those specific risks. And as such, there is a risk that they may not incorporate or take into account other risks in those supply chains. And measures really do vary to the extent in which they list severity and likelihood of impact as a criteria to inform a company's due diligence approach. In terms of stakeholder engagement, both of the mandatory due diligence measures have direct stakeholder engagement expectations within them, but they differ in terms of the emphasis or level of detail. The corporate reporting and the trade-based measures really include limited detail on stakeholder engagement, although some of the detail then comes through in accompanying guidance. One of the things that we also noted was that publication and disclosure of due diligence processes is the most common feature shared by the mandatory measures, with 8 out of 10 measures mandating businesses to publicly report on the due diligence they're undertaking. But the format of this disclosure and the information that businesses are required to share really varies, again, significantly between the different measures. And there's also considerable variation in the approaches to enforcement, i.e. the authorities that are responsible for enforcement, as well as the penalties or the sanctions associated with the measures. And lastly, the report considers further research and the need for further research to understand and address the impacts of the measures, as well as the lessons learned from the implementation. Noting that many of the measures have really been put in place in the last 3 years, so it's very early to carry out a comprehensive study on the current or future impacts, which is why the work on scenarios is so critical and so interesting. Going forward, the report recommends to foster greater policy coherence around internationally recognized standards on RBC and due diligence, which can promote greater predictability and effectiveness of due diligence for companies and their suppliers in agricultural supply chains, which echoes again the findings of the other paper that was presented. It can also help to ensure that policy expectations on due diligence are designed in ways that avoid unintended consequences and de-risking or disengagement from higher risk suppliers and geographies. And also the risk of pushing costs and requirements upstream to suppliers. Governments also have an important opportunity to coordinate around accompanying measures to build capacity, create an enabling environment for RBC, and promote engagement and partnership with key producer and consumer countries. So a lot of the same messages, I think, coming across from the different reports, which is wonderful to see. I will stop there, but thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the panel session afterwards.
you. Thank you very much, Sophia, for the nice presentation and giving us such a wonderful overview about these 24 different measures in different countries. And yeah, we see a lot of similar outcomes in both papers. It's really important. And we also, I think, we see a lot of room for harmonization in both papers. It's discussed that we should give a more focus on harmonize the different methods here. And now in our panel discussion, we like to give a special focus on the topic of partner uptake. These regulations put a lot of pressure on partner countries, especially partner countries, low-income partner countries. So it's important, like Christine mentioned, that norm diffusion should happen. So it should be, so these measures should be taken up by other countries as well. But in the end, from that, we see a lot of open questions, and we like to discuss these questions with our very important panel. And I go here and go on from our sofa here with our first panelist, Dr. Mitzi, from the EU Commission.
Just in time.
Leonard Mitzi is head of unit at the European Commission, DG for International Partnership, Sustainable Agri-Food Systems and Fisheries since 2017. Prior, he was head of unit for 10 years in DG Agri, inter alia for agri-trade and development issues. And he could also give us some insights into the recently launched Team Europe initiative on deforestation-free value chains. So we are very happy to have you here in our panel. Thank you very much for coming. And my first question regarding both presentations is, how can producing countries be supported best to prepare for the various due diligence requirements we have now? And what has the EU already put in place, and what else is planned by the EU to help these countries? Could you give us some hints for that?
Thank you a lot, and thanks. Actually, I attended both what Christine and what Sophie just said. And it's true, this due diligence and the deforestation regulation has created and is creating still, I would say, a lot of anxiety in our partner countries. What was not mentioned, this is a very geopolitical, highly charged situation where mandatory regulatory processes don't always help. But there is a political decision that was taken by the college, and we, as civil servants, have to execute it. Now, as civil servants, we are not just blindfoldedly go in execution mode, although the background has to be seen within the context that Europe, the European College of Commissioners, the member states, this is not only Commission, this is the Council and the Parliament. It is an interinstitutional decision, have decided to show a leadership role at the highest level of the European Union across the global context. Now, there are lots of processes which Sophie from the OECD mentioned. It was clear that a voluntary, soft approach is not doing the trick. So a mandatory approach was necessary. It was imperative. If you do, we all go to conferences that speak about climate and the need to be bold and robust. And I come here every year to Grunewald to speak about rights-based approach and human rights and child labor and being leadership. This is the only way to show leadership, to be bold. Now, I also heard Christine about what I call the preconditions of all this. Impact assessments. We did an impact assessment. Could it have been done better? Clearly, some of us are academics. We can go into impact assessments at various depths. Can an impact assessment be comprehensive and detailed and the silver bullet of every impact assessment? I don't think so, because started data sets are not there. But impact assessments are not done in a blind way. And so with DG Environment, with DG Trade, with the college, with the institutions, we have now, you mentioned the deforestation regulation. I am in charge of the international partnerships rollout, meaning how to accompany our partner countries. We launched with Germany, German support, but other member states, the Netherlands as well, France, a Team Europe initiative on EU deforestation, 70 million portfolio to accompany the countries across the various value chains. During the Belgian presidency, so now, we have a big conference coming up in April, and we will, for example, go into detail what we are doing in cocoa value chains through our cocoa talks. This is a process which has already been going on for the past 3 years on child labor issues, on living wages, living income, geospatial data. All this is to accompany also cocoa producers in our partner countries, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, but others, in a process of transformation change. If we speak about transformation of food systems into a human rights-based approach, into an approach where we tackle really at the grassroots deforestation, this is the only way forward. Now, is there risk of trade deflection effects for those who are in the... Basically, you shift sourcing from high risk, standard risk, low risk. Can this happen? Yes, it can happen, but we, as a big player, two-thirds of our market is originating, so goes to the European Union. We consider that this could be what I call a very bold, transformative approach also to support farming communities in these countries, in the cocoa-producing countries. Clearly, we are doing the same in Indonesia on palm oil, and in other countries when it comes to other higher risk commodities. And through a Team Europe approach, we can scale up our support. Is support the only solution? No. Christine mentioned partnerships, multi-stakeholder approaches. This is what we are trying to do also at grassroots level. Cocoa Talks is a multi-stakeholder approach, mobilizing not only farmers, retailers, multinationals, trade unions. Can we do it in every commodity? This would be hard work. Is it impossible? No. But imagine if we have to do stakeholder, commodity, country by country, commodity by commodity, it is an impossible task. So if there is the appetite that we do, and we do it in coffee value chains through the International Coffee Organization, that's what we're trying to do also with the Brazilians. So country-driven, demand-driven, and also accompanying smaller countries. Tomorrow we have a discussion with the Ethiopians that has been facilitated also by Germany on the coffee value chain. So yes, we are dialoguing and we're trying to see how best to accompany these countries in this process of change.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe a short question. We have similar challenging requirements, especially for by the EU triple CSDDD. For example, living income is a very new topic. Living income, living wage. Will we see also such initiatives to support the countries for this topic?
Look, this has to be part of the ecosystem, looking into the living wage, living income, into accompanying in the context. When we speak about food systems, we have to look into wages, into incomes. You know, from a European point of view, we have a global gateway. Global gateway is an entry point for heavy investment, both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, to support the process, for example, on skills, on education, on climate. Now, this is a short, medium, long-term process. It's not an easy process, also because you have competing models out there. If you go in a partner country can say, I want this model and not your model. Let's be clear, the European model is not only the model out there. It comes with certain conditions. It comes with certain accompanying measures. Maybe a country will say, and you know, that countries can pick and choose the models that they want. They can use a European approach, they can use a US approach, a China approach. There are different models out there, and to try to tackle incomes, biodiversity. You know, even we in international partnership, when we have an action fish, we have to tick a lot of boxes. The gender equality dimension, the income dimension, the biodiversity, the climate target of 30% plus. This is hard work, and it takes time. Can we do more dialogues? Yes. Are we doing sufficiently across the globe? No, we don't have the human resources to do this across the globe. I have to be frank. That's why we have Team Europe. Team Europe is the only way where we can mobilize, unleash the full potential of Europe, not all the 27 member states, but usually between 3, 5, 7 member states, to actually accompany the process, to harmonize, to concentrate, to focus, and to target and have a bit of a division of tasks.
One last question for the moment. You have heard some different recommendations from Sophie and from Christine. What are your priorities dealing with that?
The priorities are to make the regulation as seamless, as smooth as possible. I would say most of the recommendations are very pragmatic. Dialogue is key, multi-stakeholder transparency is key, but it's a necessary but not sufficient in a context of complexity, because we are dealing with complex situations. You can't discuss all this in a vacuum where countries are under financial distress. You have to discuss also the indebtedness, the financial flows, the cash flow, the prioritization, the question of trade dynamics. It's not only EU and Kenya or EU and Ethiopia, it's the intra-regional dynamics of the country. Because you can also have a situation where trade flows might decline or be compensated by intra-regional dynamics, which at the end might not be a bad thing for that country. So all this has to be factored in the debate. Is it always factored? No. But that is also important that we are also looking into the African Continental Free Trade Area, looking also into local and regional markets, but also not forgetting the weakest part of the value chain, which are the farmers, the cooperatives. But again, there you need to support farmers' organizations, cooperative movement, and that is what we do with the Rome-based agencies, with UNIDO, and other players. So that is a critical point to have all hands on deck to actually, the big challenge these days, not only in Germany, across the European situation is money, ODA, official development assistance, becomes scarcer and scarcer. And that is the big challenge because we are in a geopolitical context with the aggression of Russia on Ukraine, with the Middle East crisis, with migration flows. You have lots of new priorities, and clearly we have political decision makers have to make decisions, and also our partner countries have a lot of sort of sectors to focus on. Question is, will they focus and will everyone focus on the sectors to converge on what we are trying to achieve, of which food is one of them.
Thanks a lot for the first points. We come to our next speaker on our panel here for today. This is Gunther Beger. Please, thank you very much for coming to us. Gunter Beger is the Managing Director of the Directorate for SDG Innovation and Economic Transformation at UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Before, Gunter Beger served as Director General in Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and yeah, some say you are the father of our German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, our German national law. So at least you were highly involved in that. Thank you very much for coming to us today. And let me first ask you a question to Sophia's keynote. One of the recommendations Sophia highlighted the many due diligence approaches in the G7, suggesting a kind of norm diffusion. So what kind of problems does this development create for our partner countries from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Spiller, for inviting me. First of all, I think it's a little bit too much to say I'm the father. Perhaps I think it would be also make my former and current boss angry, Mr. Müller. But nevertheless, of course, I was as Director General in the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development very much involved in this in the more or less first part of construction of this law, and then I went to started other duties. But nevertheless, it was for me very let me say very interesting to say it in that way, what I heard from our both keynote speakers. And honestly, sometimes I think, even from my current position, where I have to deal with the consequences of the German law and of course of all these things, the mandatory, voluntary approaches, regulations about we discussed or we heard today. Sometimes I think it would have been better to have your study, your exercises before more or less starting a legislative process. So it's very interesting. First of all, I will come later to you. I will invite you to have a meeting, a seminar with our colleagues in UNIDO to discuss the result of these studies and also the recommendations. Because that is what I learned during the last 12 months when I worked for UNIDO. On the other side now, with farmers, with small and medium enterprises, they suffer. They suffer under these requirements, regulations, and there is a lot of, let me say, not frustration, but anxiety, how to fulfill all these requirements. And I very much remember when I had my first discussion with representatives of our partner countries. I think it was a colleague from India, and I was a little bit proud. I said, I had to do with this law. He told me, oh, Guy, what did you do? Yeah, have you ever discussed with us? I think that was the most important point. There was no discussion, or less discussion, let me say too less discussion with our partner countries about the requirements, the implications, and what it will be more or less as consequence for our partners. So sorry, now I will come back to the question. Yes, of course. You know, I'm German, and I was very much involved also in the discussion, the first discussion here in Germany, and and you know all the let me say, the concerns from our German companies, big countries, multilateral companies, who said, oh, that is too much, your regulations are too much, never fulfill, it's not possible to fulfill. And then you have to imagine there is a small and medium enterprise or a smallholder farmer, a cocoa producer, and he has now to deal with these requirements. And so I very much support your recommendations. We have, of course, to reduce the variety of requirements, and we have to inform our partner countries, governments, but also associations, farmers, about what we want to implement. And of course, there is this Team Europe initiative, and I know that Germany is more or less a frontrunner in this initiative. But let me say, 70 million euro is not enough. It's really not enough for to more or less to deal with all the consequences we are produce. So you see, perhaps 2 years ago, if you invited me to such a discussion, I would have spoken another way. But nevertheless, I see a lot of problems, and I think yes, communication is important, information is important. We have to combine our forces. We have all UN organizations, but also Commission, national governments to combine forces. If not, I think this regulation will be a boomerang. We will leave. We will lose a lot of these farmers, these small enterprises, these people we want to help.
One instrument which could be useful to reduce bureaucratic burdens could be certification. And we have a lot of certification schemes in the agri-food sector. What do you think? What is the role of certification, and should we improve this instrument? Could it be useful, or do you see problems, for example, from our partner countries in using such certification schemes?
In general, of course, certification systems are good and a first step also to improve conditions. We as UNIDO, for example, we start now a partnership with Fairtrade, for example, Fairtrade International. And of course we see, and we have now also the father of Fairtrade Germany, Mr. Overath. He's now one of our advisors. We are very proud of it. But nevertheless, this kind of certification, of course, is a very good first step, and especially come back to fair trade, for example. Yeah, this has brought, of course, a lot of improvement, especially if we speak about wages, and this is a very good first step. What we also think is what more progress we could reach if we also try to improve value chains development. Let me say it, for example, one figure I learned during the last days is Africa imports every year 50 billion of processed food. 50 billion of processed food. 80% of the processed food is imported to Africa. And I think that is another very important point. Improvements, living conditions, wages, you can of course reach if you develop value chains, if you come to processing. And I think that is another very important point. we have to invest more in especially in the agriculture sector and the food sector in processing to create added value. And added value, of course, that follows higher incomes. And that is also something you invited me as UNIDO. That is our more or less specialty. We are the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and the development, the improvement of food processing industry. That is one of our key issues, key jobs we have to do. And I think in improvement, in added value, that would be a great chance also to improve living conditions.
Thanks a lot of challenges. I would like to introduce our next guest on the panel. So now we have talked about the governmental role, and now we are coming to the private sector, and I would like to introduce Johannes Graf von Kaiserling. Johannes is head of corporate social responsibility at the Handelsverband Deutschland, the German Retail Association, leading organization of the German retail sector. So about 75% of all retailers are organized there. And previously, Mr. Kaiserling was head of CSR at Aldi Purchasing, and he also was a postdoc at the University of Bochum for corporate responsibility topics. So, Johannes, from a company perspective, you have heard a lot of challenges, and that the public sector is, it's really a big challenge to help partner countries. What is your opinion from the viewpoint of the private sector for the implementation, so the acceptance of these regulations? What are your experiences?
So very generally, we found that there were many situations in which, when our retailers talk to partners in the supply chain, in countries, for example, in Latin America, I heard of some cases, then there was simply not enough awareness, I think, of our due diligence regulations that we have and that we think is important. So, and this has very practical consequences. For example, when there were certain complaints and one of our retailers tried to really address this with a producer in the region, in Costa Rica, then when trying to improve the situation, they were asked to make corrective action plans, which is part of what we know, what needs to be done and everything, but they really did not know what is to be done. And here a lot of work also in terms of communicating what is meant, what we think is important and why we need to work together in order to make improvements. There is much work, and of course this is not what retailers alone or the economic sector can do. I think there is more to be done also on the side of maybe, well, of course, governments and, on diplomatic channels should be used here more, I think. And when it comes to implementation or our role in helping to make actual improvements on the ground at the beginning of the supply chain, I think when I read the papers, maybe the role, especially of the retailers, is the influence that the retailer have could be a bit over. There is not that much influence that we have on these very first tiers of the supply chain. So especially when we look at the agri-food sector, there is always one supplier at least between us and the producers in the region, and therefore what we can really do to assist them is in the end limited. So here we definitely need to work together. We have, as the Retail Federation organized a training, for example. It's a training platform that retailers, that all suppliers can use, and we really try to start from the very beginning and raise awareness for what due diligence means, or why it's important, to raise these concern of human rights, etc., in these different sectors. But here again, we found that there is very little understanding, and we think that there is so much more to be done in this context. And of course, I saw on your list, Sophia, that there are many of these initiatives in the cocoa and palm oil industry, also for protein feed. These are things that we do and that we have been doing in previous years, also before there was mandatory regulation. And we want to continue doing these things, but here, of course, as you said, we need to work together. We need to combine forces, so I'm really looking forward today to debate with you as well, in order to understand a bit better what your expectations are of the retail sector, to really make these improvements on the ground. So of course, we can hand out all these codes of conduct and ask partners in the supply chain to really to guarantee certain requirements and so on. But I'm not sure how effective this is in the end. And so there must be more efforts on the ground that go deep into the supply chain, and there we need the help of other actors, definitely.
Are you, as retailers, in contact with partner countries as well? Government, for example, in partner countries?
Sometimes we are. So when there are some complaints that reach our retailers, then of course this is what we do and that we need to do. And but here again, the most important thing is to make sure that these complaints reach the retailer in the first place, and therefore we need very good complaint procedures. And here, as the retail sector also organized together with Mr. Möller, the Appellando platform, which is an alliance for such grievance mechanisms. And this is, again, very important. We need to work together. And if we work together as an alliance, we have probably a better chance to really get in contact with governments, with civil society in the region. But here, as you already said, this is very difficult. So we would need to do this for most high-risk commodities in different countries. So this is really a long to-do list for the future. But we want to do that. And I would say that as the retail industry, we have been front runners, I would say. We have been doing these things long before the mandatory due diligence requirements. It's in our own interest. We have these consumers who want us to do these things, and we really want to make these improvements. But yeah, we see that there is still very much to be done. And the resources, of course, are limited. And therefore, we are happy that it's a risk-based approach, especially or also in the European directive, as it is planned now. And this is important. We really do it step by step and look at where we face the highest human rights risk, and then get there step by step. And for example, in the case of Appellando, where we have this alliance for complaint procedures, we start in southern Spain. But this is only the first step. Then we need to move on, and we need these experiences there, and then we move on to other countries. This is the plan. I think this is the ambitious plan that we have together.
If I understand it right, you have read both papers.
Well, the first one and the second one was a bit overnight, yeah.
Yeah. But if you could highlight one or two recommendations from papers, what are, from your point of view, the most important recommendations?
Well, So there were many recommendations which I think are important. One where you stress that it could help, or that it's important that especially in the first years of implementation, the authorities should not look too closely, or at least not if there's minor errors. This is important now. I think when we talk with BAFA, the promise that they make in these days is that once they start really controlling and with their Prüfpraxis, they will be not too strict, because this is still a time in which we are all learning, and we need to have this mutual trust, I think, that we really want to make these improvements. We also want to improve supply chains, the human rights situation in supply chains. And therefore, I think this is very important to have this leeway at the beginning, to make sure that in the end no one really leaves these procurement markets. I mean, this is what I admit the lobbies as well really stress this point very much, that there is this risk that companies could in the end leave these countries because of, well, risk that they cannot control. But as you said, this could be the case with this boomerang, right? So we really need to make sure here that we have these authorities, the BAFA in this case, as a partner with which we can discuss the problems that we face in controlling risks in our supply chains. This is very important. I mean, because there are so many products, so many commodities. There is thousands of suppliers, and only in the case of fruits and vegetables. So this is really very difficult, and here we need to work together, and we need the authority to trust us, and really so that we can make the improvements together. Another thing that I think is important also in this context, to make sure that companies don't face too much a risk also for their reputation and so on, is that we have this safe harbor regulation, or this safe harbor clauses in the regulation. But unfortunately, this is not going to be the case, I think. So you called for such a part in the regulation, but as far as I know, in the current political agreement on this corporate sustainability due diligence directive, there's not going to be a safe harbor regulation. So there is not going to be this incentive, which you also mentioned is very important, this incentive for certification schemes to actually get better and better and better. Then we would have this interest aligned, right? We would have this interest then, as well as retailers or as whatever other industry, to really have very good certification schemes that are supervised by BAFA or whatever state authority, and we would want that to be very good as well. And I don't see why there is not going to be such a safe harbor clause in the regulation, but this is very unfortunate. So I think this would have been very important. But this recommendation was already missed, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we are coming to our last panelist, Bettina Rudloff. Bettina is a senior researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, SWP. Her expertise is at the interface of trade, agricultural policy, and foreign policy. And this expertise was very useful for our discussion, and it was wonderful to work with you together, Bettina. Thanks a lot for that. And Bettina supported us really a lot. So my first question, Bettina, is with regard to the interaction between due diligence regulation and trade agreements. Could you summarize some of the recommendations we made in this direction?
Thank you very much. So thank you for having me, and as well for having me for the report. That was an honor and a very great experience for me. The recommendations on the interfere space between the due diligence initiatives, so we look at the 3 already mentioned, and trade agreements. One issue is coherence. And if you look at, we did that, the one who had already had a look like you, we have a very, very long annex where we tried to compare what type of human rights and environmental rules are covered by the 3 due diligence initiatives and by an exemplary free trade agreement, which is the recent, the youngest ones between the EU and New Zealand. And if we compare them, it's not necessary to go through all the details, but you see immediately that there's a huge divergence, what is covered where. So that is one observation we made, and one recommendation is trying to make it more coherent in terms of that the convergence is more harmonized. Why? Because divergence means cost. That means in the end welfare loss. That means maybe loss in political trust as well, not only for companies here, but as well for delivering actors in partner countries. So that is one recommendation. Another recommendation is, coherence must not necessarily mean always harmonization. It could mean as well use or make the best use of synergies. And here one could address to the issue that the package of due diligence approaches is a kind of sanctionizing approach or enforcing approach for human rights or rules in order to make that as a binding requirement to sell to the EU. And this issue of sanctions in free trade agreements always was a very, very sensible issue. Thinking about EU-Mercosur, there the partner side, the Mercosur region said, with these sanctions, that's a problem. And at the same time, we have this due diligence approach. And there a recommendation could be to at least think about to separate these packages in terms of the due diligence package is a kind of sanctionizing package, but maybe not to force them so strictly in future trade agreements. We know that this is a political, very sensible issue. However, maybe Leonard, he stressed the term geopolitical. We are really in a different phase now, or in a very difficult phase as well trade-wise, thinking about WTO, multinational decline. Maybe that's an approach in order to become more successful with new trade agreements. Another recommendation is to really think this as a package, due diligence and trade agreements, and possibly to be more flexible from the EU side in offering interesting issues like market access to trade partners, or let trade partners be more protective if that's in their interest for their own markets. So to summarize, to be more flexible, more compromise capable, facing trade partners.
And Bettina, in the end, do you see more trade-offs between corporate due diligence laws and trade agreements, or more synergies? Will this discussion help us for trade agreements like Mercosur also?
It's really a very sensible issue. I would say it's a bit a kind of dilemma. At the EU side, the idea actually was in the past as well internally to get support for new free trade agreements. That's at least how I would interpret it. To have a mechanism which ensures more sustainability issues in international value chains. So thinking about criticism, for instance, from France, as well from Germany very often, thinking about TTIP, and all these debates. So there was a need internally to support acceptance as well by stricter sustainability requirements. From the trade partner side, of course, that's a bit different. They feel, the EU implement a package without consulting us. We discussed that already. The neocolonialism criticism. Within free trade agreements, at least there is the idea to have a negotiation. That means you have two partners bringing in the interest. So for them, the problem with this unilateral due diligence package was actually the opposite compared to the EU. So now we have to find a way how to combine that better. And that's why at least our recommendation goes a bit in the direction, think a bit more creative, maybe reject from the sanction because you have the due diligence. Think about incentives as well in free trade agreements. So if that would be manageable, then there could be a synergy. And that's not only relevant geopolitically. If we still want to follow new economic trade agreements, which are by the way as well a political relevant alliance system, even for sustainability issues that can be relevant. If we lose trade partners, if we have the leakage effects, if we have trade deviation, then in the end as well for sustainability issues, nothing has been won. So that's the boomerang as well.
Leonard, do you agree with Bettina?
Probably there is, I would say, fatigue of trade liberalization. You see it in slowdown of enthusiasm, EU strategic interests becoming more and more relevant. I hear more food sovereignty, issues around trade, open trade, let's be cautious. NGOs tell us, look, clearly trade is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem, but many are seeing it as part of the problem. Then you add these layers of sustainability, high standard setting, social, environmental. I would say the next 6 months are going to be critical. We are approaching an election period, which is extremely charged. We came out not really 100% of COVID, we still masks. COVID is past, we have a vaccine, but we are in war still on the borders of Europe and in a Middle East context, which is extremely complicated, which has mega spillover effects. Like we spoke about trade, rerouting ships to avoid the Suez Canal. This is creating a lot of anxiety in value chains. We don't even know the repercussions, the food inflationary effects. We didn't speak about food inflation between a German retailer and the Zimbabwe case, for example. So if trade and trade concessions, and we'll see what comes in the WTO in a few weeks' time, I would say, let's see what the European elections show, what will be the future or not of the EU Green Deal in its sort of current context. The past 3 years was very strong, robust regulatory approaches, and clearly we moved. We didn't speak much as Commission officials. Clearly, for economists, I didn't hear the cumulative effect of all this. There are cumulative effects of regulation. How do you do the corporate due diligence, the deforestation, MRLs, maximum residue levels, organics? So this is complicated stuff if you do cumulative effect of all this and extra layers. And then a Brazil or an Indonesia technically can handle all this, but imagine a small country like, I don't know, Burundi or so. There are certain challenges out there which are differential. Can we handle the Brazils and Indonesias and Ethiopias potentially? Yes, but if you go across the globe with all the value chains and then embed them in a trade concession point of view, And this is what we are discussing also within the context of the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements. When you enter into the TSD chapter, Kenya was the recent one, but then if you go into the Ghana and then have a cocoa component eventually, that is what we are trying to test. But the big question is, will European citizens and the new political landscape in a 6 months' time want more or less of this? And we will know the result in June. And then we'll see what type of college and the formation of a college, because it is a critical year. Probably for those who have been, like myself, on Luckwell in the last 15 years, this year, or these past few years, are much more complicated now than ever before.
Okay.
Because this is not a financial shock only, but it's a political shock as well.
So tough times for a new instrument. We have time for 2 questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Please raise your hand again. Martin. Oben.
Martin Petrik, Justus Liebig University in Gießen. I take your last point as a player to focus a bit more on the benefits and costs also of this debate. I would like to raise this question of the costs of the due diligence. Of course, there can be a very big debate. I would just like to ask one small question to Herrn Kaiserlink. From your partners in your association, I mean, what do the CEOs think about this due diligence in terms of cost and impacts on their budgets? What is their true opinion on it?
So maybe let's not start with the CEOs. I see really very much enthusiasm in the teams, in the CSR teams, the sustainability teams. They really want to make improvements. They want to do more and more. And maybe here, one problem of regulation could be that it is getting a compliance problem, although there are so many people that really want to take the initiative, be creative, how to improve things in the supply chain. But then it's a compliance issue only. And how do we comply with this law? But now about the CEOs, I haven't seen them as enthusiastic so far. I don't see any serious complaints from their side. They also see that we have this responsibility. Now we have this law, which gives us this structure in which to solve these problems. But we also see that it's much more costly than was expected by the government, right? So you had this calculation. I forgot this number because it's so small, and it's and it's really very, very high costs, and there is always more and more people getting employed in these corporate responsibility teams. So they are not happy with this. And if I may note one further thing, we need, and this is another recommendation, we need to get the assistance from the authorities, BAFA, etc. And I think one thing that is worrisome is that there is so much money spent on big four consultancy firms. Why is that needed? Why isn't there more things that we get to know from BAFA, etc., so that this is just not needed? And they earn so much money with this. This money could be spent on other places, I think, better.
Okay, next question. Here in the front, please.
I used to work for the European Commission as well, Leonard, in the agriculture department. I have a question to Sophia. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I have a question to Sophia on your study you did for the G7. We talked about implementation difficulties and maybe a slowdown in enthusiasm depending on the result of the elections. Is there any element you think which should be reinforced in due diligence if there's a next step to look at? What is missing? in the political approach? And the second, maybe, what is the right international environment to discuss about harmonization of approaches? You did the study for G7, which is more the industrial world, OECD as well. Is it G20? Can it be UNIDO? Can it be CFS? Where would you see some productive discussions? Thank you.
Thank you for those two great questions. I'm going to start with number 2, because I think that one I've got a little bit more of an easy kind of answer to. Well, very interestingly, earlier last year, at the beginning of 2023, the OECD had a ministerial on responsible business conduct and due diligence, and out of that ministerial came a couple of different, a ministerial declaration, which included a recommendation for the OECD RBC Centre and our investment committee to do work on coherence and develop a platform where we could discuss policy coherence around due diligence measures. So this is something that certainly the OECD is planning to look at in more detail. And to your point on, is it the OECD, is it G7, these are relatively developed countries. Our membership within the RBC Centre does go beyond OECD countries and includes I think we now have 51 adherents to our declaration, the M&E guidelines on multinational enterprises. So there is certainly interest and enthusiasm to get a kind of broader representation there. We also developed a recommendation on the role of government in supporting responsible business conduct and due diligence. And there it's really it's a kind of blueprint for what governments should be doing to support business, including by leading by example through public procurement practices and developing the kind of supporting framework to support businesses in achieving due diligence and these measures. And then in terms of what could be reinforced with regard to due diligence and the political approach, I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about more of a risk-based approach, this recognition that we can't get things right first straight away. There is a learning process, and one of the things that we emphasize within our due diligence approach is really it's about demonstrating improvement. It's not necessarily about achieving things straight away and being penalized for that, but year on year demonstrating improvements on your targets and setting those targets and showing progress on those. And I think that's one of the things in terms of really trying to ensure that you don't see disengagement, you don't see companies pulling out of high-risk regions, high-risk suppliers, not pushing costs up the supply chain. I think that the risk-based approach and this more progressive improvement on issues is something that could really be reinforced.
So one last question is possible, I think. Who is? Yeah, okay, here. Please. Yeah. A colleague here, third row.
Thank you. Just a comment followed by a quick question, actually, to Leonard. First, the comment, I love the way you communicated EU position on the regulations, which we believe it's a communication message that is missing in the field down with countries. So I'd love if the same message is communicated with the EU officers on the field when they speak to the partner countries, because it was so nice in the way you've done it. The question is actually on the certification verification programs. And some they say that with the tsunami of EU regulations coming up, that this will create a market opportunity for more and more private schemes to come up as an opportunity. And we know that businesses will not wait for the governments, member states to set up their verification programs. They will jump on the private schemes to show compliance. What is the EU position on how you would like to monitor, control, regulate private schemes? And I love the recommendation from Christine. And it was so to the point that calling for minimum requirements for the credibility of schemes.
Look, the question of proliferation of private schemes or the cumulative effect of all this, the regulation is trying to streamline this. So I think what is clear is that we support the governments to have a clear vision of what a regulatory process like the EU deforestation regulation implies. We have an FAQ, a frequently asked questions, with guidelines continuously updated, because there are things which we are still sort of refining, and today it's much better than 3-6 months ago. Dialoguing with the public authorities, 70 million is this peanuts. It's not big money, but it's sufficient money to start the process. We hope that member states will join us to actually support these dialogues. It's important that we engage with all the actors of the value chain, including retailers. Retailers, we don't engage much with the retailers. We engage a lot with the smallholders, with cooperatives, with processors. But clearly, the dialogue with the public authorities is critical, and to see how private standard setting can be reconciled also. But as Gunther said, our focus as European Commission is to give a signal of adding value. It's important to add value, because this is the only way forward in a green growth, inclusive approach, especially in countries in Africa where value addition is extremely weak. However, all this process is hard work, and it has to be done in a medium to long term without creating massive shocks in the short term.
So, 2 small comments at the end, Gunther and Christine.
Yeah, I just wanted to come up again. This is why it's so important to think about why were these regulations implemented? Because there are real issues in value chains with respect to child labor, with respect to slavery, with respect to these issues. And so I think it's really these regulations have to become a success. And a success in that sense that companies are willing to engage and are willing to address these issues. And this is why I think it's also monitoring. We did not mention it here in the presentation, but it's in the study. Monitoring is very important to see the development and to see the progress that hopefully is being made. And this is what I really wanted to highlight again, that there are real issues, and this is why we need to see success here. Thank you.
Will you add something, Gunther?
Sorry for the 17 million. You know, I don't speak for the German government anymore, but I compare it with, and I know the figure was, for example, the German government spent for supporting German companies to inform them about regulation, and this is much more than 70 million what Europe, and I don't say European Commission, this is a Team Europe initiative, is ready to spend for the rest of the world. So if you compare it, thank you.
Bettina.
Maybe one comment from my side on the question of certification, although that's not my specific area, but being involved in a lot of dialogues with trade partners of the EU, for instance, Brazil, one issue relevant could be to better mutually recognize what is existing in our partner countries already, instead of forcing each and any single trade partners to follow our certification requirements. In trade policy, we know this issue of mutual recognitions, although that's difficult to come up with a consensus. However, I think that's a very important sign to the trade partner side to accept and acknowledge their own knowledge and traditions on certifications, which are very often in place since long.
Thank you very much for joining our discussion. Today we run out of time, but thank you very much for giving the OECD and the Scientific Advisory Board the opportunity to present our results, and thank you for discussing this with us, and in tough times to find new ways to improve, like Christine said, these very important goals which we have here. Nice Green Week for you all, and see you next year here again. Thank you very much.